Today I'm going to talk about breeding for abiotic stress tolerance, and like many of the lectures in this course, there are entire courses related to this. Specifically, Tim Setter has two courses on crop physiology, crop soil science 610 and 613, dealing with stress physiology and various mechanisms. He doesn't deal a lot with breeding for tolerance, so I've sort of borrowed from Marianne Banziger's program at CIMMYT, originally in Zimbabwe. Now she's located in Kenya in Africa, for trying to tell you a little bit about breeding for abiotic stress tolerance. But to begin with, just a reminder, since it's been 2 weeks or so since we talked about biotic stresses caused by living organisms, diseases, insects, nematodes, and parasitic weeds, and differentiating that from abiotic stresses caused primarily by environmental factors. Water stress, temperature, and nutrient stress, the most important. And we'll talk about the importance and the nature of these stresses. We'll talk a little bit about drought, heat, salt, and nutrient deficiencies. And then I'll hope to spend a lot of the time today talking about the breeding and finish up talking about climate change and how the climate is changing in the long term. We really aren't sure. Probably we are undergoing global warming, and all indices say that our temperature is heating up, but at least we know that long term our worldwide climate is changing. And it's a simple matter of too many people and too many automobiles and too much pollution and affecting our ozone layers and affecting our atmosphere. And plant breeding offers probably the most effective and the most economically feasible solutions to sort of counteract that climate change. The abiotic factors actually cause more yield suppression than all of the diseases and insects and parasitic weeds combined. The most significant factors are either climate or soils that are not favorable for crop production. Only 10% of the world's surface actually provides soils that are arable and normally do not limit crop production. And water availability, or lack thereof, is the single most important factor that we're going to face. And before I forget to mention it later, we will talk about breeding for end user traits and talking about biofuels and production of ethanol. We must remember that when we're using renewable resources such as crops to produce ethanol, in a sense, we're buying gasoline with water. And we don't always think about what if we run out of water before we run out of fossil fuels, which is a real possibility. There are lots of problems with water, waterlogging, and drought. High and low temperatures are certain. Soil salinity is a big problem. Inadequate minerals, too much or too little light. I will primarily talk about drought, heat, nutrient deficiency, and salinity, or buildup of salts. I said about 10% of the Earth's surface provides land that normally doesn't limit crop production. The dark areas are basically where we have land that is typically fit for agricultural production. On all of these stresses, I'll illustrate with drought. Drought stress involves the timing, the duration, and the intensity of water deprivation to a crop. And the impact on yield of that crop depends on how long it stays dry, the growth stage of the crop, the species, or in some cases the variety within the species, the soil type, and management practices. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes. When you start breeding for abiotic stress tolerances, you have a lot of factors that you have to evaluate. You can't exert control over very many of those. Is drought important? Well, this just shows the rainfall pattern from 79 to 90. I think this is in Africa. And the maize yields. Pretty much, if you get rain, maize will produce yields. If you don't get rain, you don't get much yield. You notice the lines cross over here. I don't think that's due to Marianne Winziger's efforts to produce drought-tolerant crops entirely. I think we'll fall back beyond that limit relatively shortly. But in general, plants need water in order to survive and to produce yield. The reddish areas on this graph basically are areas that have a very high vulnerability for drought. Sort of the gray areas are deserts. I mean, there is very little water and there's no crop production, but the reddish areas, high vulnerability, the yellow areas, moderate vulnerability for droughts. If you look at water stress predicted by 2020, again, the darker areas are expected to have severe water stress, the intermediate color, moderate, and the lighter areas, less water stress by the year 2020. Heat stress, talking about heat above 30 degrees centigrade. For every 1 degree increase in temperature between 30 and 40 degrees centigrade, yield of our major cereal crops are reduced by 10%. So if we're actually undergoing global warming and we're talking about temperatures rising from what? The 80s Fahrenheit upward, the mid-80s upward, then we're talking about severe reduction in crop yields. Why does that happen? Plants use more energy for respiration, so they burn more of their energy without producing yield. As the temperature increases, crops tend to mature earlier and earlier, so there's less time to produce the yield. And if the temperatures get high enough, you can actually damage the photosynthetic and energy metabolism of the plants. More importantly, when plants undergo high temperatures, they sort of shift their metabolism. Heat stress sort of induces a whole series of metabolic changes to produce heat shock proteins. These proteins can come in the leaves or in the seedlings, and basically can result in lower transpiration, increased metabolic rate, but metabolic processes going towards compounds that help protect the cells and keep them alive rather than compounds that will produce useful yield. Salt stress is another very, very major stress. There are 954 million hectares of salt-affected land, almost 70% of that in Asia and Australia. Why is so much of that salty land or salty soils in Asia? Primarily because of irrigation. As irrigation increases, we draw fresh water out of the ground water tables, and seawater encroaches into those aquifers. And so as we irrigate more and more and more and utilize more and more water before the rainfall can replenish it, we tend to get more and more salty water. This salinization will result in 30% land loss in the next 25 years and 50% loss of arable land by the year 2050. Water use has increased fivefold since 1940, and the yellowish-green bars are used by agriculture. And so the use of water for crop production is going up almost linearly. There's not enough fresh water. Some people claim today less than 1% of the world's water reserve is fresh. The rest of our reserve, and so this little slice here is fresh. The rest of it is either becoming salty or in the form of ice. So most of the water on Earth today is salty. Of course, 70% of the Earth is covered by oceans. And so nutrient deficiencies, nitrogen, phosphorus, micronutrients, actually deterioration of soil and loss of organic matter are major factors that result in crop stress. I just put this in as sort of a summary. You can see from 1960 to 2000, our production of food almost doubled. Our population doubled. Our percent of irrigated land almost doubled. Our cultivated land didn't increase much. So most of this increase in productivity was accomplished by higher yield per unit of land. Water-stressed countries went from 20 to 28. Nitrogen fertilization and phosphorus fertilizer usage, 8-fold increase and 5-fold increase in use of nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizer. So you can say certainly for Asia, this is pretty much the result of our Green Revolution. The Green Revolution varieties started coming out in the 60s and were really applied in the 70s. Those varieties allowed us to dramatically increase yield per hectare by adding fertilizer and applying water and managing those crops to maximize those yield levels. In terms of micronutrients, I know this is, so as I said earlier, as you can clearly see from this slide, I know this is hard to see, but basically boron, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, and zinc, and a series of major crops. Most crops have one or more micronutrients that are essential, and they're very, very sensitive to lower levels of those nutrients. The pH of the soil plays a big, big role on the availability of the nutrients, particularly some of these micronutrients. And as the pH of the soil becomes more acidic, these nutrients are bound. And so acid soils, the red areas, are very large problems and significant places where food production is necessary. Okay, so that sort of sets the stage in terms of the importance of all of these factors. So breeding for abiotic stress tolerance is clearly a high priority. But if you look through the literature, you'll find that most plant breeding programs don't deal with abiotic stress tolerances. And there's some very solid reasons for that. Most plant breeding programs breed for crop production under high yield conditions. Why would you think that's the case? Do you think plant breeders just decide that maximum yield is the most important characteristic, therefore I want to do my breeding under well-managed conditions? I mean, you have two options. You can either select your varieties under good management conditions where you might control the level of nitrogen and phosphorus and overall fertility, and in some cases even apply water and control the water needs, and you try to control as many of those environmental variables as possible so that when you make a selection, it's more likely that the differences you see are due to genetic effects rather than environmental effects or genetic by environmental interactions. So given a choice, if you're given a job and you're told, okay, you have 5 years now to develop your breeding program and produce successful varieties, trust me, you're going to do your breeding under environmentally controlled conditions as much as possible. You're going to try to tilt the odds to favor that you can make selections of true genetic importance rather than waste your time selecting environmental effects which are ephemeral, don't show up the next generation. So you get a less environmental variance and you can select the genotypic variants. That's what essentially the breeders who developed the Green Revolution wheats and rice did. That's why the Green Revolution bypassed drought-prone areas where input use is low by necessity. I mean, even if you have access to fertilizer, it makes little sense to apply the maximum recommended rates of nitrogen and phosphorus if water is going to limit your yield. So even if we had access to these resources in places like Africa, it makes little sense to pour on the nitrogen if you don't have enough water to develop the crop. If you breed in stress environments, well, and I show you in the graph here, these are two different varieties. These are the mean yield of the environments. So you can see, you can select varieties that yield at least at some level in poor environments. And as you get to higher and higher levels of productivity from the environment, you can select for varieties that yield increases actually exponentially in many cases. If you're breeding in stressed environments, varieties must be selected under multiple stresses and variable stress conditions. So you can expect you're going to have low heritability, you're going to have large genetic by environmental interactions, your genetic variance is going to be very, very low, and you're going to make very, very small gains, if any gains.
Where's the graph from?
I can give you the reference. I think I'll give it a next slide maybe. I think it's a study of wheat from one of the studies that Marion, let me see. Yeah, I think it's from Benziger and Cooper 2001. I can get you the reference on that. But that leads me to the next point. In the previous slide, it looked like even down in these poor environments, you get measurable distinct yield differences between varieties. Actually, when you're dealing with low yielding environments and environments where you're likely to be subjected to different stresses, this is what you actually see in terms of the performance of those different varieties over environments. So how do you determine what is genetic variance and what is environmental or interaction effects? The point being, the less management, the lower the level of management that you utilize, the more variability you're going to have across all of your experimental plots. This not only holds true for farmers, this holds true for your nurseries and for your yield trial plots as a breeder. So what are the characteristics of these environments? First off, there are multiple stresses. The biotic stresses are all there, as well as abiotic, and water and nutrients being the primary problems. But the variation occurs both over locations, in fact, even across a given field every year, but the variation also occurs from year to year to year. And so in a plant breeding program where you must select cycle after cycle after cycle for improvement, during a dry year, you're likely to select varieties that perform better under dry conditions. The next year may be wet, so those varieties may not perform so well, so you start selecting for varieties that respond to higher levels of water. And over cycles, then, you find that you take one step forward and two back, and one forward and two back. And their different factors can express differently. Different environmental factors can be expressed differently on different traits. If you have nitrogen stress, for instance, it reduces your leaf area, reduces transpiration, and so if you stress your crop for nitrogen, you can somewhat alleviate the water stress problem. Because if it doesn't have enough nitrogen to grow and develop, it doesn't need as much water. That doesn't mean that by breeding varieties that are sensitive to nitrogen stress, you're going to get drought tolerance. It just means that the major stress becomes limiting and affects the expression to those other stresses. So how do you go about breeding for abiotic stress tolerance? Well, there's a strategy that says, yeah, we can go in and characterize our environments. We can use GIS and GPS technology, and we can characterize our environments, and then we can select varieties that perform better under those conditions. And all we have to do is evaluate from 100 to 1,000 genotypes at 100 to 1,000 locations each year. We can compare the genetic variance across the environments over years, select the best genotypes. Perfectly sound strategy for developing abiotic stress tolerance. Problem is, in addition to requiring the access and utilization of GPS and GIS technology, it requires lots of money and lots of years. Currently, it's not a viable option, even in developed countries, particularly in some developing countries, because of infrastructure, farm size, low market value. But even in developed countries, we don't have enough support for our plant breeding programs to do this. Certainly not in the public sector. In the private sector, it could be done. But the private sector doesn't need to worry about breeding for abiotic stress tolerance in marginal environments. Why not? Well, but why don't they, I mean, out of the goodness of their heart, why couldn't DuPont Pioneer develop nitrogen and drought-tolerant maize varieties for Africa? There's no profit. There's no money. Who's going to pay them to do that? So we're often critical of our private breeding programs, but actually our private breeding programs can utilize all of this type of technology, and they actually do a very good job of breeding varieties that meet farmer needs. Unfortunately, they only do that breeding in markets that have a profit potential. Our public plant breeding programs that should be developing these varieties to meet farmer needs far too often don't base their breeding objectives on what the farmers need. They base their breeding objectives on what NSF or NIH or some foundation will fund. And so the big disconnect that we have is public programs that should be looking at this type of strategy don't get funded. It's as simple as that. So CIMMYT has come up with an alternate strategy. Their alternate strategy is, okay, let's don't try to breed for all of these multiple stresses, for all of Africa in this case. Let's prioritize the types of stresses. And we have to consider both biotic and abiotic. So let's get let's identify the stresses that are most important under farmer conditions. And since we have absolutely no control over the other stress conditions in farmers' fields, we'll bring those stresses onto our experiment station, where we have at least some control over other factors that could complicate matters. So we screen genotypes under both high-yielding optimal conditions as well as under stress conditions that occur in the farmer's field. And if you do this with a large number of genotypes, from 100 to 1,000 per year, select the best, you should be able to make progress. The objective being, don't try to simulate a farmer's field. That's far too complex for us to make any gains. But to screen phenotypes under stress conditions that have a high probability of occurring in those farmer fields. And for Marianne's program in Africa, the target environment deals with mid-season drought, not early season or flowering period, late season drought, mid-season drought, nitrogen stress, and 5 diseases which occur pretty much every year in varying amounts. So will that work? Well, here's a case. This is a well-managed plot. This is a nitrogen stress plot. Marianne would have other plots that are well-managed versus water stressed. She'll have other plots that are protected against diseases versus inoculated with diseases, or at least spreader rows are there to provide inoculum. So that you can manage these stresses one at a time, eliminate a lot of the G by E interactions, select for improvement or real genetic improvements in a step-by-step fashion. And so basically, compared to classical breeding where you look at yield potential, disease resistance, and then run your multi-location testing, she looks at yield, disease, drought tolerance, and low nitrogen tolerance. And out of this, ran a comparison of 42 hybrids developed by the CIMMYT program versus 41 hybrids from the private sector who are selecting almost entirely for yield under optimum conditions. And she tested those. This shows selections for drought tolerance, for nitrogen stress. The results. This is what the farmers are growing today. This is what the stress-tolerant varieties do. And in fact, to show that in a little different way, this is the yield level of the private varieties, varieties from the best seed companies at that time in Zimbabwe. These are the experimental varieties coming out of the CIMMYT program. So clearly there is a yield advantage over locations, but interestingly, this goes from locations that average about 2 tons per hectare to locations that average about 9 tons per hectare. So as the productivity of the location increases due to better management or lower stress conditions, the yield of both of these varieties increases.
When they make selections, when they score the plots that if a plot has to do well in both the good environment and the stress environment, and then it gets sick, and then it gets liquid.
They hope to identify plants that do well under each stress and also do well in a good environment. But basically what happens is you find some that do well under nitrogen stress and some that do well under water stress and others that have the highest yield. so you didn't recombine among those different types and reproduce another set of varieties to try to combine the stress tolerance with the high yielding. But yeah, in fact though, if you utilize heterosis, if you develop hybrids that can maximize heterotic potential, these guys were not selected for stress at all. I mean, still, at these low productive environments, even the industry varieties show that level of yield, not much, low below the CIMMYT varieties. But, sort of the interesting thing about this slide is these guys don't fall to pieces right down here, which a lot of people will tell you. Commercial varieties don't do well under stress condition. Well, they do just about as well under stress conditions as anything else the farmer can grow. But what's more impressive is the CIMMYT varieties not only beat the commercial checks in the low yielding environments, but still run with them as the management level goes up. So theoretically, you would say that in order to have stress tolerance, the plant has got to utilize a certain amount of energy to give it that tolerance, and that energy is not available for yield. But in point of fact, that heterotic potential appears to be great enough that these plants can utilize whatever they have to do to be stress tolerant and still can produce a lot of yield. Yeah?
Is there any point of management practices in which the check varieties will outpace the CIMMYT experimental varieties?
Where these checks will pass the experimental? Yeah, I'm sure you could. If up to 9 tons per hectare, it's possible to go up to 20 tons per hectare with maize. And if you really pump on lots of nitrogen, lots of fertility, and provide irrigation, these guys probably would catch up. But this is a real world range, or at least for Africa. For Africa, this is a real world range. This is sort of a dream in the future range. All right, I just mentioned markers, genomics, and transgenics all are useful. Just some examples. This is a QTLs in sorghum for a stay green component, which is an important measure of late season drought tolerance. This is a little genomics or maybe proteinomics skit of all of the various proteins, functional and regulatory, that can improve drought stress. And there are programs looking for genes that control all of these proteins in major crops. A lot of this work is done with Arabidopsis, of course, where the genome is known and characterized, but a lot of it is being brought in, particularly into rice today. Transgenic plants, tobacco and Arabidopsis are used as model systems, and all sorts of mechanisms for drought tolerance or salt tolerance have been incorporated. I think we got some slide. Yeah, this is the wheat variety with a DREP gene from bacteria, the tolerant versus the drought sensitive materials. This is a wheat variety that basically has a gene for accumulation of mannitol, which provides protection, the sensitive, the tolerant, and the non-stress control. And this is a rice variety. I don't know which is the control or which is the stressed. I can't see it from this close. But these are the sensitive ones. It's a rice variety with a stress tolerance gene from barley. All right. To finish up, talk about effects of global warming, which seems to be the direction that our climate is moving. As we get higher temperatures, accelerated plant development, less water, lower water use efficiency, and even reaching heat stress. So what can plant breeding do about that? Well, as temperature increases, we could get a decrease in crop yield. We could require more water to produce the same amount of yield, and rainfall will become more erratic. Droughts will be more frequent, but also flooding stress and waterlogging stress will occur because rainfall patterns will shift, and areas that have been dry might suddenly get more rains, and areas that have had sufficient moisture could dry up. Why does yield potential decrease? The energy for respiration, the early maturing crops, and damage. Why do crops need more water? Under drier conditions, if relative humidity goes down, crops use more water, transpire more water when humidity is low, and the frequency of droughts will increase, and drought definitely affects plant yields. So what can plant breeders do? To begin with, the importance of all of these biotic constraints will be altered by climate change. We're likely to see increases in diseases, insects, and parasitic weeds, particularly if the environment continues to warm. So you can develop resistance to those factors, then you can match the crop growth cycle to the stress. Photoperiod and temperature response is highly heritable. It's very easy to change maturities. In fact, over the years, the U.S. maize crop maturity has undergone tremendous shift towards earliness, to the point where we used to look at southern Iowa, Illinois, and across Nebraska as being our primary corn belt. Our corn belt now is moving towards Minnesota and South Dakota. We need access to both longer and shorter duration varieties. In parts of Africa today, there's not real drought tolerance in some crops like sorghum and millets, but drought avoidance because they can select varieties that will grow and mature during a short rainy period, or they can select varieties that can start in a short rain period, survive through the dry period, and mature and flower during the longer rainy period. Varieties with superior levels of water stress. Erie's working on flooding tolerance. Icrosat's working on waterlogging tolerance in pigeon peas. Drought tolerance in rice is being done by Erie. CIMMYT's working on wheat and maize. Icardia on barley. Groundnut, sorghum, pearl millet done at Icrosat. Beans at CIMMYT, and cowpeas at IITA. So lots of programs are in effect today to try to direct at least drought tolerance, and probably as many are undergoing today looking at salt tolerance, particularly when you throw in the molecular work. Drought and salt tolerance often are very, very compatible. The same types of molecules and proteins that stabilize the plant against drought conditions often provide protection against salt. But also the development and introduction of substitute crops, other crops that aren't on our list of major current crops today. We'll talk about some of those, actually we'll talk about those next lecture when we talk about micronutrient change. Oops. And maybe my next lecture I also have my Harvest Plus slides in there. But the Harvest Plus program is actually looking at increases in crops that respond under low levels of nutrients. And ironically, what they're finding is crops that do well under low levels of micronutrients also tend to have higher levels of those nutrients in their fruit and their leafy parts that are consumed. So I'll stop with that, and Monday we'll take up on micronutrient effects. Any questions?
Would it be a viable plan for strategy to get two growing seasons in one if they see like you get a maize variety that matures really quickly so you can plant two crops for one season? That's
done often. lots of areas, particularly in Africa, where they have a bimodal rain distribution. And in some cases, they grow the same crop under both the short rainy and the long rainy period. In other cases, they rotate one crop for the short period to a different crop for the longer period. It's done routinely. The problem that they have with these long and short rainy periods in Africa is you're going to get rains during this period of time. You just don't know how much rain. And what's happening today is the rainy periods are coming, they're shorter in duration and less rainfall during the rainy periods. So even though the farmer has adapted and knows when to plant different type of variety to capture the rains, there's still no guarantee that those rains are going to start on time and will come in sufficient quantities.